If Gaza right now is an explosive pressure cooker, the occupied West Bank is bubbling over in a violent boil.
Okay, I'm going back. I'm going back. Avanti.
Gaza and the West Bank are two separate entities. Different rules, different governments, different living conditions. But Gaza and the West Bank share a common people. So let me explain the relationship between the two and how Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's retaliation on Gaza has turned the West Bank into an active battleground. When Hamas carried out its devastating attack on Israel just over a week ago, killing more than 1,300 people, young, old, men, women, families, foreigners, three things followed. One, a tightening of Israel's grip on Palestinian freedom of movement.
I'm here in the occupied West Bank, which is now under complete lockdown by the Israeli authorities.
Two, we saw a huge influx of weapons into the West Bank, all into the hands of Israeli settlers. Thousands of assault rifles along with helmets and bulletproof vests. Civilian security, the front line in many armed conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. But the third thing we saw, Palestinians taking to the streets and a recognition that this violent outburst by Hamas was a long time coming.
جايين نوقف مع أهلنا في غزة ونوصل لهم رسالة إنه إحنا معهم وإنه هم مش لوحدهم، جايين ندعمهم وعشان نرفع معنوياتهم.
The West Bank is home to more than 3 million Palestinians, but Israel has controlled that space, occupied it for decades. The government there, the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, largely cooperates with Israel.
Mahmoud Abbas has essentially been, at least on the ground to a lot of Palestinians, sort of irrelevant. He's seen as aging and corrupt, ineffective, really not having offered politically the Palestinians any prospect of hope. Hamas has sent a clear shot across the bow that the Palestinian Authority is, if not completely irrelevant, at least it's not anything that is going to be able to really bring about any sort of solution.
And Palestinians increasingly feel squeezed. In the last 50 years, hundreds of Jewish settlements have been built in the West Bank. That's hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers pushing into Palestinian territory, and it's all considered illegal under international law. But it happens, and a literal wall prevents Palestinians from pushing back. 700 kilometers long, heavily fortified, dotted with observation towers, surveillance, and security.
A wall is either built to protect or to separate.
Israelis call it a security necessity. Palestinians call it the apartheid wall.
Okay, I'm going back. I'm going back. Avanti.
behind that,
The occupied West Bank is now not only occupied, it's effectively blockaded. The Israeli army has turned it into an archipelago of separation. 3.2 million Palestinians are simply stuck.
Israeli settlers have killed at least 3 Palestinians in attacks on a village south of Nablus in the occupied West Bank.
This decades-long conflict between Israeli settlers building homes and Palestinians who feel increasingly penned in became dramatically more violent since Hamas fighters poured across the Gaza border into Israel on October 7th.
In the last few days, there have been attacks waged by settlers against Palestinians, burning Palestinian homes, properties.
Since the Hamas attack, Israeli security forces and settlers have shot and killed more than 50 Palestinians in the West Bank. That includes a widely reported incident where an Israeli settler was filmed shooting a Palestinian at point-blank range near Hebron in the south. Meanwhile, hundreds of checkpoints, maybe even more than that, keep Palestinians from mobilizing on a larger scale. According to Human Rights Watch, Israeli forces routinely turn away or delay and humiliate Palestinians at checkpoints without explanation, while permitting largely unfettered movement to Israeli settlers. The response from many Palestinians? Fire and stone.
أنا اليوم جاي أدافع عن حق الوطن وأنا اليوم بنساش حقي وأنا كشاب فلسطيني وساكن يعني في فلسطين.
There are some Palestinians who are unsympathetic to the death and destruction wrought by Hamas. At least one who spoke to CBC News told us he doesn't actually believe Hamas did what it did. And for people like him, Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza only underlines decades of Israeli occupation.
We are seeing the excessive use of force by Israeli soldiers against Palestinians. And if you ask them, they would tell you that the excessive use of force against them is not something new.
This kind of thing just doesn't build up overnight. It comes after years of settlement expansion, land confiscation. What happened in Jerusalem and what's happening in Gaza was the last straw. It's about, for these people, years of Israeli pressure.
In a poll conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in June, so before the Hamas attack, just over half of respondents support a return to armed intifada, a third uprising, and that armed action is the best way to end the Israeli occupation. Now, complicating all of this is the fact that you have a number of people in the West Bank for whom that isn't actually home. There are hundreds of Gazans who, for example, have day jobs in Israel or were in the West Bank visiting family who have since the attack been rounded up by Israeli police.
More than 60 Palestinians were detained in less than 12 hours across the occupied West Bank.
The number of daily detentions has tripled over the past week.
They have no idea when they'll be able to go back home to Gaza to see their friends, their family, their children. There are also about 100 Canadians in the West Bank who've registered with Global Affairs Canada. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says a first group of 21 Canadians has taken a bus from the West Bank into neighboring Jordan. But for the vast majority of the West Bank's 3 million people, the future is uncertain. The fear is that the reality today will become the norm, and the violence isn't stopping.